So, welcome everyone to our December 2021 edition of Church and Society. Here, I'm Reverend Phil Dieke, serving at White Rock United Methodist Church, and I am so grateful to have Reverend Lisa Garvin joining me. She is the chaplain at SMU, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and kind of give her a little bit of background information about her before I start peppering her with all these kind of questions. Just because we're really fortunate to have her. She serves a couple different roles. Not only is she the chaplain, she also serves on the board of the General Board of Church and Society. Which one of the things, it's really funny that you say, how do you say that title, right? Because you serve on the board of the
Yeah.
General Board of Church and Society, which is a very funky way to do that. But anyway, so Lisa, I'm really glad that you are joining us, and we'll probably have people popping in and out as we continue our conversation. And so, as people join us here live, you're welcome to interject with your questions as you hear them come up. If you are listening to this later and you want to ask Lisa questions, I'm sure she'd be happy to. You can find her on smu.edu website, and
Yeah.
she's all there. And there's even an Instagram account for the chaplain's office, and you can find that. So. But yeah, Lisa, anything you want to share? I do have one question for you for your intro, but anything else you want to share intro wise, we'd love to just hear it.
Okay, great. So you're gonna ask me a question before my intro?
Well, no, go ahead. If you have anything you wanted to add about like as far as being a chaplain and on the board and stuff, but the question that I wanted to ask because we're in Advent
Okay.
is, and this is what I've been using because we've been studying incarnation. We did like kind of a 2 week deep dive on incarnation at our church, and so the question I kept prefacing each week was, "What is your favorite sense today?" Because here we are as embodied people with senses, and so what is your favorite sense today?
My favorite sense. So of the six senses
Yeah,
that
there
we
you
all
go.
have, right?
Yeah.
I think today my favorite sense is taste. It's probably because I was just eating a little something so I could make senses. So I'm most aware of the sense
Yeah.
of taste right now. But also we talked a little bit about COVID, and I haven't had COVID, but my understanding is that many people have lost their taste. And I was with one friend who was just getting her sense of taste back as after having COVID while we were having dinner, and sort of seeing her appreciate that sense again.
Okay, we had a little hiccup there. Apologies. We are back, and so Lisa, we were talking about senses, and you said that you had a friend who lost sense because of COVID, and that taste is your favorite. So, but you didn't get a chance to finish your introduction. So take the floor.
Right.
Go ahead.
So my introduction, aside from that, so as Phil said earlier, I'm Lisa Garvin. I'm the chaplain and minister to the university at Southern Methodist University, or SMU, here in Dallas.
Pony
I
up.
got here, that's right, a little pony up. I arrived in Dallas in October of 2020, and have been here since and hope to be here for a while. People keep asking me how I like Dallas, and I'll let you know when the pandemic fully lifts, but I'm
Yeah.
beginning to get out and about. My membership is in the Mississippi Conference. I'm an ordained deacon in the Mississippi Conference, but I also have affiliate membership here in North Texas, which I'm excited to begin to get engaged. This is one of my first opportunities to be engaged in North Texas Conference. And as Phil said, I serve on the General Board of Church and Society, which you all know a little bit about. And I think Phil and I are going to talk a little bit about
Yeah.
my role in that organization, as well as my work as a chaplain and sort of how those intersect. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So, in case anybody doesn't really know, General Board of Church and Society is kind of the short layman's version, maybe, is kind of the justice arm of the Methodist Church, and not that the Methodist Church as a whole isn't engaged in justice work, but it's kind of the branch of it that's encouraging that to continue and push forward. And so we have it here at the local church. We have it in our North Texas conference. We have a board, but then there's the global church has a general board of church and society as well. And so that's the board that you sit on. And what led you to get involved in that? How did you wind up there?
Well, I would say my interest was because it is sort of the church's expression of its commitment to justice. And I was familiar with the work of the agency. We have a building on Capitol Hill. If you aren't familiar with that, it's the only non-governmental building on Capitol Hill. It was built by United Methodist in 1923. So we're about to celebrate our centennial.
That's awesome.
It sits on Maryland Avenue, but it's right by you look out on the Supreme Court from one window and the United States Capitol from another window, and then Senate buildings from another window. And we focus on advocacy, both on the national level. So with Congress, obviously that location is very helpful with that. As well as the international level, we have a small office at the UN as well, and are very engaged in international policy advocacy. And then we also do educational work, which brings United Methodist and others to the building, or that we've been doing a lot of webinars with COVID, and thinking about, educating on these issues that are important to us as people of faith, and then giving us tools of how we can actually be engaged in this work of justice, either in our communities or from policy kind of perspective. So I knew of the work of Church and Society since my conference, Council on Youth Ministries, had gone to a UN DC seminar, which is one of the programs that's run out of Church and Society, where youth groups or other church groups can go up to DC and learn about an issue and then engage with lawmakers and other organizations around those. In 2012, I was a delegate to General Conference from Mississippi, and as a delegate, your name goes into a nominations pool for general boards and agencies. And I expressed an interest in potentially serving on Church and Society, and I was selected.
That's awesome.
And so I have been on that board since we're in what I call the quadrennium that never ends. You're supposed to have a 4-year term that's renewable for another 4 years, but 8 years max. But because we're in a quadrennium that never ends, I'm in year 9 of my service on the General Board of Church and Society. And
year 10's coming up.
Hoping to make it to a decade and then be done.
Yeah, and the quadrennium hasn't ended because we haven't had General Conference because of COVID. It keeps getting pushed out. Yeah. You mentioned the building, which I had the chance to go, I guess, in March of 2020, right before. I remember flying out there to DC, and there were some people who were kind of freaking out about this whole COVID thing and wearing masks on the plane. But it was kind of just like, it's probably not going to be a big deal, But, but yeah, I love the way it's positioned, and the mythology behind it is, I don't know if it's true or not, right? Was that they're going to build the building on an angle so that you see the Supreme Court out to the left as you walk out, and you see Congress out to the right as you walk out, and just to let the government know that we are watching. Which I love that.
I don't know if that mythology is true. I think it works today, but I actually think the building was built before the Supreme Court, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, really?
Yeah, somebody can Google that. I'm not going to do it right now while we're talking.
Sure.
But I think I recollect that from other questions. I think we might have preceded the Supreme Court building.
Like all good mythology, it makes for good story,
Exactly.
Yeah, but if you've ever seen pictures of the marquee too, they usually have a really good marquee, which also just kind of faces there toward Congress and says good little quotes of justice. I'm still waiting for somebody to start the Instagram page of the marquee for.
I will pass that idea
Methodist
along.
Building. I think it's a great idea. But
we have a brand new director of communications, so I'll pass that. Could be the first thing he does.
I love it. So that's kind of your role on the general board. How did you get into then being a chaplain? Like, what led you toward that aspect? Because you were at Emory before, right?
I was. So this is my third location as a chaplain in a college or university. All 3 schools I've been in have been United Methodist schools, which I think just is because we resonate. It hasn't so much been intentional, but I like it. I think the root of how I got into this as my expression of ministry is I grew up in a university town, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and the church that I grew up in, which, along with my family is the primary source of my formation, was immediately across the street from the university. And so the university president was a member of that church. My Sunday school teachers were people who were on faculty and staff at the university. And my faith was always formed in a way that questions and sort of critical engagement of scripture as well as the history and tradition of the church that's what it meant to be a person of faith, right? And so as I finished college with no intention of being a clergy person, and having been, I would say, sort of marginally participating in chaplaincy and campus ministry on my own small liberal arts campus, Methodist campus, I just started thinking about the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I found myself applying to work in churches and applying to work at colleges. And just, I won't go through my whole unfolding of my career, but all of a sudden I realized like the two intersect in chaplaincy and campus ministry. And how it made sense with my formation and my passion, because I really, as I've mentioned, I'm a deacon in the United Methodist Church, and part of our call and commitment is to connect the church to the world, as you well know, Phil. And so I see part of my own vocation as helping people to identify what their gifts are and how God is calling them to use those gifts in the work that they do in the world, whether that be what they do to make money, right, or to make a living, or just how they live out who they are in the world. For me, those things converge. And what better place to do that than a college campus where students are discerning that same thing, right? And I also really like, what I love about being a university chaplain, particularly in United Methodist institutions, is that part of my work is individual work with individuals discerning these things, but part of my work is also institutional work. What is the vocation of the institution? How does the institution live out its identity and its gifts, where it is and in the larger world? And so that, I get excited about those things and sort of figuring out, what I'm learning now. SMU is the first place that I've been where I don't have a history here. At Millsaps and Emory, I had been a student in both of those places and sort of knew the institution and the ethos and some of the people, what I'm finding fun and challenging here is sort of learning the culture and the ethos and what is the vocation of this place and how do we live that out more fully.
Yeah, that's a challenge. SMU is quite a place where it's a fairly small university. 6,000 students, right?
6,000 undergraduate. We're about 14 to 15,000 total.
Okay, with grad students too. Yeah. So you have that, but then it's my experience being there, because that's where I did my seminary studies, was at Perkins at SMU, and it's pretty siloed. I feel like to me, like you just had a lot of different silos on this pretty small campus, right? So even just bridging those silos to understand the vocation of one institution when it feels like it's a whole bunch of micro institutions under one umbrella. I'm sure is quite a challenge.
And I think SMU, my impression has actually done a lot of work to try to eliminate some of the silos. And based on my previous experience at other institutions, I think they're making good progress, but that there are different sectors, right? And that's natural and a big insight. The university is very similar. My other professional work has been in what I like to call church bureaucracy. I've been on the conference staff in a couple of different roles, and as we've discussed already, I've been involved in the church on a global level, and the universities are no different than the church in its sort of larger sense. In terms of just organizationally, I would say, and politically in terms of the body politic, not, liberal or conservative.
Sure. So there's a ton of specific issues we could talk about, and COP26 just happened, and you talked about the webinars that were taking place through the General Board of Church and Society, and well, it was a multi-day webinar series, right?
Yeah.
That they just
Yeah.
hosted
Yep.
all about climate, which I only caught a couple of them. I needed to do better, but they're still
Well,
available,
I'll
right?
just say, don't forget your question, but I'll just say, so that was what they're calling now a called seminar. And they had started doing those prior to COVID, 2 or 3 days. That some of it was, I think, web linked, and others, some of it was in person. So I think I would just say be on the lookout for others, but also they archive all of that. It's all recorded.
Yep.
And so anybody can go back and look at that. And I, like you, I was only able to live watch, I think, one. But I recommend anybody who's interested in climate change, and I hope we all are interested in
Right.
climate justice, to take a look at some of those.
I'll make myself a note here and put the link to the webinar in the description down below. So if you're listening to this later and you want to check it out, just check the description and you can find the link.
Great.
Yeah, let's see if I do remember my question now, which I do. Yes.
Sorry.
No, you're good. So talking about this idea of, your title is interesting because it's Chaplain and Minister. And so when I think of minister, I do typically think of, it's individuals, but it's also to a community, which you have that whole sense at SMU, where you have individual students who clearly need ministering to. But then you also have this opportunity to be in ministry to an entire group of people like that. And also a space where you're training young minds, right, to think critically, like you were saying, which is I just love college, right? I love college campuses. They're just an incredible place. There's nothing like a college campus where people are just open. They're open to try to understand what's happening in the world. They're learning so many new things. So I wonder what the role then as the chaplain and the minister to this campus looks like for how you do that on an individual level. And I know you have a team of people that are working on this too. But then what's the role of kind of like trying to be the voice of ethics on the campus as well, and influencing, what does this mean for the School of Business, and how are we trying to be a moral voice for the School of Business as well as engineering, and all these different things? How do you see that playing a role with this idea of justice in your specific role?
Yeah, that's a great and big question. So let me try to take a couple
Sure.
of stabs at it. First you referenced my title. I think there's a history to my title that I'm not fully familiar with, but what I have picked up is it's very important. And so I'm part of my own sort of getting to know a new context is what do those two titles combined? What does each mean, and what's the importance for that? I think I'll take the question and sort of as an opportunity to talk about sort of my philosophy of how I do this work. And as I said, part of it's individual and part of it is institutional, but then in that there is also sort of what I call group identity. We work with, practically speaking, we have over 20, and I think it's closer to 30 religious organizations on campus. Some of those are entirely student-led, and some of those have people. So for instance, in the case of United Methodist, Isaiah Terry, who is the Wesley House director, is supported by Highland Park United Methodist Church, and that's the United Methodist presence on campus. And so they are fortunate to have great space. A staff person who has some other folks who work with him, a supporting congregation that's on the other side of campus, a lot of resources, where then you have other groups like, for instance, the Muslim Student Association, which I have a part-time imam that I contract with that provides some support to them, who's on my staff, but that person has a lot of other responsibilities and how he makes a living as well.
Sure.
mostly the student organization is a student-run group. There are other groups like that, you know, so we also and then there are Christian groups that are similar. There's no staffing. But all of those groups, regardless of what their resources are, they are what I call the front line for individual discipleship, and for practices, right? Like they all have either small groups or Bible studies or big weekly worship services. In the case of the Muslim group, they have Juma prayer every week on campus. In the case of our Jewish group, they have a Shabbat meal together once a month. But that's where sort of the individual formation in the tradition of your choosing or your exploration is happening, right? And my job, the job of my staff, is to work collaboratively with the students or the judicatories that are sending these folks, right? And to ensure that there is fair access for students and things like that. And then our work then sort of has a focus. So it's important to me that every major faith family have a primary communal gathering on a regular basis on campus. So our office ensures that there is space and resources for, as I've already mentioned, Juma and Shabbat on a regular basis. And then we have a Protestant Christian worship service once a month, and then some other Christian practices other times during the month at that sort of same time. And then we also have a very strong Catholic center on campus that has Mass. Our student body Catholics are the largest religious identity on campus.
So interesting, isn't it? At SMU, Southern Methodist University. Yeah, I always found that interesting.
Yeah, but that's also been true. I was telling a Catholic colleague this morning, that's been true on all three campuses that I've worked on.
Really?
Huh. We could talk about that, but I won't go down that road now.
That's for another day.
But so then our work becomes, what I hope that our work is about how do people of faith live in the world? And for me, that often involves questions and issues of justice and ethics, right?
Yep.
So what are conversations that we can bring people of a variety of religious commitments or no religious commitments, but values of some sort, into at least conversation, if not collaboration, right? At least conversation around these important things that are impacting the world. So race and racial justice might be one conversation. Climate and climate justice might be another conversation. Poverty might be a conversation. I also like to think like some of that, I try to be intentional about my language around justice and not injustice, even though a lot of what we're working on are the injustices, right? But to sort of frame it in a positive way, or what are we hoping for? What do we think the building of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven? That's the work that we're trying to be about, right? Yeah. And what do we need to know and do to be co-creators in that, right? And so the Civil Rights Pilgrimage is one of our existing really hallmark programs. Spring break every year we take, and it hasn't happened the last 2 years, but that's what I've been working on this morning. Yeah. We're taking at least 30 people to Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee to sort of trace some of the footsteps of the civil rights freedom fighters, and to learn from that, and to look at what's happening in those communities today, where there's we know from all that's happening in our world that we've made progress, but there is still much to be done in the area of racial justice. And so what can we learn from those histories of the past? What are some of the continuing struggles in those communities and our own community? And is there something that we learn from these foot soldiers of the struggle, right? Or that are, and maybe it's not, I would say it's not that we just do what they did, we follow their blueprint, but we can be inspired, and hopefully that those conversations that we have and reflecting on that inspire a new generation of drum soldiers, as drum majors, as Dr. King would say, right?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's uniquely positioned because SMU has not only an undergrad degree but a master's degree, right? Or is there an actual master's degree now in human rights, or is it part of the liberal studies?
I think it's part of the liberal
I think
studies.
that might be right too.
Yeah, there is, but yes, SMU is one of only, I think, 7 or 8 schools in the country that has an undergraduate degree in human rights.
Which is a big deal, right?
Like, it's huge. It's part of what
institutional.
It's part of what attracted me here, actually. I didn't know about it when I entered the search, and as I learned about it in the search process, it was very much a critical in me knowing that this was a good fit for me institutionally.
Well, I keep joking that one day I'm going to go back do a PhD in something, and I've harassed Rick Halpern about, like, when are you going to get your PhD program up and running? And he was like, we got to get the master's program going first. And he said, if you can just come up with $8 million, then we can maybe talk.
Right.
Like,
I think he would.
Well,
I think he would still say the same thing. That's where his energy is, I think.
Said, Rick, you don't know what I do you? So, I mean, again, we kind of floated around with some issues with climate and race and stuff like that. What are the issues that you're seeing that are really presenting among college students right now that are that they're really being active in? And, you know, I think it's easy to look at the Black Lives Matter movement and some things that have happened on campus with that. But are there other issues? Are those two ones that come up pretty regularly?
Well, I would say that Black Lives Matter is the most significant one on campus currently. And again, going back to, so my interview process, because of COVID, sort of spanned from March to August of 2020, which included the death of George Floyd and other Breonna Taylor in that time. And so I sort of began watching SMU social media, and there is very active and engaged student leadership of Black and white students, and probably all kinds of other ethnicities as well. But one of the things that struck me in my interview process when I came to campus in August is that many of the students asked me about sort of my own place in that. And mostly the question came from white students.
Wow.
And that was really impressive to me. But at the same time, I would say it is an effort that is largely led by our African-American students. But they're all in, and I think magnificent leaders.
Yeah.
They've also been really leaders in collaborating with faculty and staff, particularly Black faculty and staff, to be engaged in conversation collaboratively with the administration around what is happening for systemic change in the university. And I think that, and Maria Dixon Hall, who's a deacon and a member of North Texas Conference.
Shout out to deacons. We were in the same deacon class. Love her.
There you go. Yep. Powerful people. So she's really leading the implementation of all that work and leading the collaboration of the what is, just referred to as the administration and these constituent groups. And that has also subsequently led, there's some similar efforts among the AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community on campus. So I think which I would refer to all that broadly as racial equity. And I think the other item that the human rights program, particularly and the human rights program and the Jewish community at SMU probably don't have, there is some tension, but is around human rights, particularly in Israel, Palestine. But I would shape it more broadly just as human rights and anti-Semitism. I think maybe would be the best way to talk about. So that's something that comes up regularly on campus. And I think a struggle that we live in is how do you support human rights for all people, and how do you communicate and articulate in a way that does not target particular identities when there is some concern about a violation of human rights in particular places. And I think Israel-Palestine gives us like a crucible for that, but that there are other places and other situations in which the players and identities may be different, but the tension is the same, right?
And I appreciate the campus's willingness to engage. I know so I got to go to the Holy Land. It was the last class I took in seminary, and Dr. Robert Hunt led that. And what I really appreciated is that we studied with a Jewish think tank the first week and kind of did a lot of stuff there in Jerusalem. And the second week, we actually went and stayed in Bethlehem, and so got to go to like places like Taipei, where we sat with a priest and listen to him talk about like how they get along better with Muslims there than they do because they have a common oppressor in in Judaism, or I shouldn't say Judaism, in Israel, right? Like that's a clear distinction there, right? And that's part of the problem. But was really eye-opening, right? To hear these kind of firsthand accounts from people in the West Bank talking about that, and here I was like this seminary student, and it was not only eye-opening but just willingness for the institution to take us into a space like that to have those conversations. I thought was a really important thing to expose us to, so that we could come back and have conversations with our congregations and the academy as well to have more informed conversations about it. So I appreciate that SMU is willing to engage in those and not shy away from it.
Yep. And then I think in the human rights programming, they'd be the best ones to talk about this, but anything a student's interested in, there's one student that we have a Peace and Justice Fellowship that's named for Bob Cooper, who was a longtime associate chaplain here as United Methodist clergy person, and William McIlvaney, who was on the faculty at Perkins, I think also a United Methodist clergy person in this conference. He's now deceased. Bob is still living. But we give a fellowship every year, and we had a Muslim woman that received the fellowship this year, who's also a human rights student. And she looked at economic policy. And so she was looking at American economic policy, and it's what, from an Islamic perspective, what would be policies that Muslims could support, right? And it was absolutely fascinating. It was one of the most intellectual projects that I've seen in a while. And so I think there are just questions like that. She was really looking at the heart of what she was looking at is how does a Muslim faithfully engage the American political system, right? So and I think this can be construed. In fact, our Dr. McIlvaney's widow was there, and as well as Bob Cooper and his wife, and they were really impressed by her. We talked about how you can exchange Muslim for any religious commitment, right? And so how do we funnel these political policies through our religious commitments and beliefs? And then how does that lead us to act in our civic engagement, right? Right.
Which I feel like is such an important part of the conversation. I'm glad that you brought it up early in the conversation too, that policy really plays a role in this, right? That, I feel like for the longest time when I started in church work, it was our job is to transform hearts, like individual hearts. But the more I realize like that's still part of our job, but it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? That yes, we're working to transform hearts, but we're also working to transform systemic issues and policy and things, because those policies and systems influence hearts, hearts and minds. And I really appreciate your calling attention to that it really is this both and mentality. And I think that's what I see in your title. I see that as part of the work of what you're doing at SMU. And I mean, I just love college campuses, right? Like, what a better place to get to do things like that. And I want to shift a little bit as our time kind of comes to a little bit of a close here. Like, and here, and this is a question that was put in the chat by Emily, who was here for a little bit. Like, what is it that you're seeing with college students, and are you seeing any kind of a shift? We hear generational divides, and that millennials started to become more responsible, and we're trying to move away from fast fashion and be responsible in investing, and now even Gen Z moving even more in that direction, and that it's not a siloed mentality of like my values go here, but I make my money here, right? Like it's all intermeshed together, and people not taking a job at some places because they say I don't support how this affects either environment or how your stance on racial issues. So like, are you seeing things in this next generation? And I hate when people say like, oh, it's the future of the church, because the reality is if they're not present in the church now, then there may not be a future of the church, right?
Right.
But what are you learning from college students right now, and how are they inspiring you in this pursuit of justice?
That's a great question. I do think, and again, I'm still learning my SMU context, so I can't, anything that I say should be construed as like just
General college students and not just
general.
SMU?
Yeah,
Sure.
and my experience over nearly 20 years now, 15 years now, I guess. I think all that you're saying is right. I think that students expect a kind of integration, or at least are working, like that's what they yearn for. I was in a continuing ed thing yesterday that was hosted by New York University. It was about how the humanities and sort of the idea of the university is about meaning making. Chaplaincy is about meaning making.
Mm-hmm.
We both tend to like live together in the same place, but siloed, right? Yep. How can we come together? And one of the things that struck me as very much resonating with my experience that I think is different than when I was a college student 30 years ago. I think 30 years ago, we expected people, 30 plus years ago, I think anybody older than me, this falls true. We expected students to go sow their wild oats. They were going to leave the church for a little bit. The church just let them do that. I have all kinds of critique of that, right? And we expected that they would come back when they got married and had children. Yeah. And until people about my age, that sort of worked, right? I think people younger than me, or where my age and younger, maybe didn't quite come back. We got married a little later, mm-hmm. and we got into it, we didn't come back. But we were still sort of going out and sowing our wild oats, so to speak, many of us. What I've experienced in the 15 years, what's been consistent in my 15 years of ministry, is that students are interested in cultivating and nurturing their spiritual life, their inward life, and a relationship with God and others. And so they have some expectations of people like me, right? I also think that all of us across the ages have been really trying, we all yearn for some level of integration. Yeah. But at this age, developmentally, it doesn't come that easily, I think. And I think there are ways in which the church could be helpful with that. But I think you're absolutely like as you talk about these sort of commitments to justice and how people live their lives and what they're willing to compromise and not, my primary example is my goddaughter, who I can take no credit for her deep commitments, even though I carry this title of godmother. Mm-hmm. She has been eating a plant-based diet since she was 10 or 12 years old. Oh, wow. Out of her commitment to the earth and care of animals and things like that. And she takes that, and it's also about, and the environment, it's largely rooted in the environment and the earth as a gift that we are responsible for stewarding. I think. Wow. She's never said it that way to me, but all the ways in which her life, she refuses to do fast, her makeup, her clothing, all of those things take those principles into account. And I would say she's an extreme.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that kind of extreme at SMU or at any of my previous institutions. But I think that and I'm really curious, it goes back to our conversation about race and racial equity. I mean, and I'm not the one to pontificate on this, but white supremacy is real from my point of view.
Sure.
And it is systemic. And racial justice will never be fully enjoyed by any of us until the whole system is dismantled in some way. And that's really scary. It's scary to me as a white person who holds some authority and power in the institutions that I live in, right? But I'm really curious to see how this generation of students and that kind of integration that you're talking about, I believe that they're going to find ways to create a more equitable world. But I think it's gonna I don't think there's gonna be this explosion, right? And that all of us, that there's gonna be a huge overthrow of all that we know, but I think little by little, piece by piece, and people, this generation and other, like, we're not too old to follow their lead, right? I mean, and that's what inspires me. Like, my goddaughter, using her again as an example, her whole family now eats plant-based diet. When I'm there and her grandmother, who I've known all my life, is there, we're like trying to figure out how we can get to In-N-Out and get a burger.
Just need a burger.
Very deprived. Yeah. But last week, her mom said to me and a group of friends she said something to us about this new Michael Pollan book, Your Mind on Plants. And at least 2 of the 5 of us have gone out and bought the book now. And I'm going to read it. And I'll say I am far more thoughtful about what I eat because of this young woman having some I don't talk to her regularly, but and that's not to say I go through McDonald's more often than I care to admit. So I don't want to be put across it, but because of how she lives her life and her strong commitments, it makes me think more about mine, right? And I'll say that it's her. It's also having been, I think it was COP 23 that I got to go to, maybe COP 21, the Paris climate conference. I attended on behalf of the General Board of Church and Society, and that opened my eyes, as well as, just some of the things that to bring this conversation sort of full circle, the things that I've learned from being on college campuses and having the access to sort of the intellectual property that happens on campus, but also through the church, through these webinars that Church and Society does, through the places I've gotten to get, the church has sent me to places around the world where I have experienced and learned our global interconnectedness, right? And I've seen in the Democratic Republic of the Congo the environmental impact that my excessive habits in the U.S. have, right? I've talked to a Methodist from Fiji at COP whatever in Paris about the displacement of climate refugees in island countries. And that at least makes me stop and think. I do not always make the right choice to make the world a better place. But I've been really grateful for the ways in both the university, particularly United Methodist institutions, and the church have exposed me to these things and not I don't consider it indoctrinated. I've just been given experiences and information, and allowed to make of that what I will, right?
Critical thinking again, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I had a woman in Jamaica one time tell me that when the U.S. sneezes, we're the one that catches the cold.
Right,
You know,
right.
and I think that's true for way more than just Jamaica.
Yeah. And it's not just the
It's
US.
not just the U.S.
People
That's
get
right.
defenses.
That's fair.
There's 3 or 4 major
Yeah,
contributors around the world,
totally.
but it is the smaller countries, whether they be of wealth or not, and the less wealthy
Yeah.
countries, and particularly some of these island. I was in England for Thanksgiving, and I was so impressed just by the messaging that was around us around sustainability.
Wow.
There are 2 things: sustainability and gender equality were the 2 things that I note. Like when you're arriving, I think it's the Heathrow Express that I took from the airport to my hotel in the city. They have all these signs about how many women work for their company, and wage parity and things like that.
Wow.
And then they're just so, I can't even think now of the examples, but just so many things that are pushing people that, well, our taxis were all electric. The whole fleet of taxi was electric, and the
Wow.
taxi driver told us about that. And
So not only even that you get evangelists about it too, huh? Like
exactly,
the taxi drivers. That's
exactly,
fantastic.
exactly. So but I was struck at how this small country seemed to be in such a different place than we are as a country. And I thought, they're on an island too. They probably they get a lot of impact. We're so huge too, right? That,
Right.
I'm from just north of New Orleans. Most people could say, well, New Orleans might be underwater in 10 years, but middle America will be fine, and I think that we just need to be more cognizant of our interconnectedness.
That's a brilliant way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap here, you mentioned this resource, Your Mind on Plants. I love that. Is there anything else that you're reading or you're watching or you're listening to that has really inspired you that you'd love to share with people?
Lord.
And it could be anything, right? Like The Watchmen on HBO was my answer to this question often, because it like really opened my, that was the first time I had ever really seen the Tulsa massacre put on TV, on a film, on screen.
Yeah.
So it's a broad question here.
Right. Yeah. I've actually been reading vigorously lately, but I'm a little embarrassed. I'll tell you what, I've been reading Nicolle Wallace. This is not profound at all. Nicolle Wallace, who you may know, she worked in the George W. Bush White House and is a commentator on MSNBC now, I think. She wrote a trilogy of books. The main character is a female president. And I actually, my childhood dream was to be the president of the United States. So I'm drawn to these characters, right? And
love it.
So it's a trilogy of books. I don't remember the title of the first one now, but the second one It's Classified, and the third one's Madam President. But one of the things that I really like about the book, besides that all of the strong characters are women, is that what I appreciate about the last one, Madam President, is the president is of one party and the vice president is of the other party, and the president is intentionally trying to bring together these divergent political views, right? And
wow.
to talk across our differences again. And I think that's intentional on Nicolle Wallace's part. And I think it's something that we all I think we have gotten so polarized politically in the US and in the United Methodist Church,
For sure.
where we don't label ourselves as Republicans and Democrats so much, but we do label each other as conservatives and liberals, or progressives is the nicer way that we do that, right?
Right.
We can't talk to each other. Yeah. And we haven't been able to find a way to work with each other. The book does not give you any tips on how to actually work with each other, so don't expect that. But yeah. I like this fictional world in which you can have these two people working together. I also just finished Jame, I think his name is James Hollis, who's a Jungian analyst. He also lives in DC, it turns out. He has a number of books, and I just read, I think it's called An Examined Life, and the second part is something about the second half of your life. And it's like this 21 step. It's based in Jungian psychology. But it also draws on what I think is a quote from Socrates about examining your life. And I've turned 50 this year, so I think I'm into my second half of life. And I just I found it to be accessible. Even I'm not a Jungian sort of groupie. I know enough about Jung to grab the phrases, but I don't think you even need to know that to sort of appreciate. And, he says, if you read a chapter a day and try to do what he's encouraging you to do, then you'll feel a transformation. And I think there's some truth to that. So, but part of it is about being who you are, which is part of what I try to teach students, right? Like what God had created us in God's image, and God asked us to be who God created us to be.
I love that.
But I think part of young adulthood, emerging adulthood, is figuring out who that is. Like we've been inundated by what others have told us to be our whole lives. And young adulthood is when we begin. I'm 50 and I
still working on it.
But who am I? And then trying to fully express that in the world.
I love that.
And then I just started watching Goliath, which I think is on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
It has some intense. I'm only on season 1, and my friend who recommended it told me it gets a little weird at times. So if anybody watches this, I don't want to be judged, but I've watched the first 3 episodes. It's law. I also love the law, so there's a theme in all of this. So it's a lawyer who sort of drank himself out of a really good business but is now, so he's now sort of a solo lawyer, and he's fighting a big law firm to discover the truth. But there are some intense parts. I think, and it's Billy Bob Thornton that's the lead character. Who I haven't usually loved his stuff, but I like him in this show a lot. So it's sort of like the end of the second episode, I couldn't breathe. I was texting my friend who told me to watch it, and it's like, what have you done?
Why did you do this to me?
But then it's one of those shows that like you want to binge the whole thing, but I'm making myself do it one episode at a time.
It's part of that examined life, right? You just little by little.
Exactly.
It's funny because I started watching the show S-E-E on Apple TV, which it's a couple years old now. I think it came out in 2019, but I'm just getting back to season 1. And that's part of what led me to this question too that we started with, right? Of like, what is your favorite sense right now? Because it's blowing my mind to think of if everybody in the world couldn't see how much things would be different. So,
okay, I'm gonna check that one. I put that one on my list.
I need a little fiction in my life because I get stuck too often in my head, and fiction lets me expand out a little bit. So
I appreciate that.
Well, hey, I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And for your work that you're doing on SMU campus, as well as through the General Board of Church and Society. And we just look forward to continued collaboration and partnership between the campus and the North Texas Conference, however we can. So if there's ever things that we can be doing as the North Texas Conference Board of Church and Society or through local churches, just please reach out to us and let us know. We didn't get to that question of like, what can we be doing to partnering with college campuses? Maybe that'll be our next conversation. But
we can have another I've enjoyed this thoroughly. So thank you, Phil. And I look forward to being engaged with you and the others in North Texas. And I'm happy to join y'all again anytime. And I wish you and everyone else a Merry Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely. Merry Christmas to you as well. We'll see you in the new year.
All right. Thanks, Phil. Bye-bye.